ആസരിൽ ചേർത്തിടണേ. കോപം വഹിച്ചുള്ളോരാക്രമി വർഗത്തിൽ ആപതിപ്പിക്കല്ലേ തമ്പുരാനേ. ലോകങ്ങളൊക്കെയും കാത്തുരക്ഷിച്ചിടും ലോകേശ നിന്നെ സ്തുതിച്ചിടുന്നു. കാരുണ്യമേകുന്ന രക്ഷകാ നിൻ കൃപാപൂരം നിരന്തരം വർഷിക്കണേ.
Today, we are honored to welcome Mr. Aravind Aji, an alumnus of our 43rd batch, who is currently working as consultant with DNV Maritime Advisory. Mr. Aravind has led and contributed to numerous projects, including the project management for DNV's decarbonization plan projects for leading ship owners. I also welcome our head of the department and all the students attending this seminar and those who are attending online. Now, it's my privilege to invite Mr. Aravind Aji to lead us in the seminar on the topic, Navigating the Maritime Decarbonization Challenge, Regulations, Fuel and Energy Efficiency.
Hello.
So first of all, I'm audible properly, right? So always a pleasure to come back and seeing some new faces, because I have already seen the 4th years at least once, but a lot of new faces over here. So coming back to the department is always a feel of joy, immense pleasure, and being able to contribute at least on a small part to maybe just share my small experience in the industry to maybe just possibly help you have a maybe much more smoother introduction to the industry in general is something that I just take immense pleasure on. So this whole topic, maritime decarbonization, you guys have already maybe arranged quite a lot of webinars on this particular topic. It deserves a very big attention for sure, but it's still coming up with a lot of complex, terminologies, a lot of things happening day to day. So it's worth it that we have discussions on maritime decarbonization, but we should definitely not restrict our discussion, our webinars only on this particular topic. So yeah, in SNAS, it's a very good initiative that we already have in place, that we are arranging webinars, but if we can just expand our topics in the future, that would be a great thing. That's SNAS. And I'm just totally confident on the team that we already have. They'll arrange sessions for you to make sure that you have a much more smoother transition to the corporate world, mostly. So I'm not taking much time on the introduction. Let's straight away get into the topic, which is navigating the maritime decarbonization challenge, wherein we'll discuss regulations, alternative fuels, as well as the importance of energy efficiency in the industry. So I'll just give a small introduction about what I do, because that's important. You know more the topic, because you need to know who is your speaker before you listen to me. So I work as a consultant with DNV Maritime Advisory. DNV as a classification society, you might be already familiar. It's the world's leading classification society, but it also has an advisory wing, which is a consulting arm of DNV, which is they provide advisory service to the industry in general. And I'm also a proud alumnus of this department. I'm from the 43rd batch. That is, I graduated in 2022. And my relevant experience to this particular topic includes I just project manage and I lead the technical part as well as for DNV's decarbonization plan service, which is to design reduction plans or GHG reduction plans for ship owners, for leading shipping companies in general. So we just take vessel by vessel, understand what its current status is, and recommend technologies to make sure that it navigates the whole decarbonization challenge in general. So also, the decarbonization, not just for for ship owners, all stakeholders in the maritime industry, which is financial institutions, charterers, cargo owners, everyone has a role to play in this transition. So I was fortunate enough to maybe just be part of a lot of projects with the financial institutions as well. So this whole, because you just need to understand maritime decarbonization from a lot of different angles altogether, not just from the ship owner side or from the shipyard side, but also from how it impacts the financiers, how it impacts the cargo owners or the charterers. If you don't know who these people are in the industry, don't worry. This topic involves a lot of jargons. The ideal way I would have preferred maybe having the whole presentation at once and then maybe having a proper Q&A session, but this session is for you. So if you feel that you don't understand any of the terms, because this topic involves a lot of terms, buzzwords, abbreviations and stuff. If you don't understand one, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to explain what it is all about. So yes, less about me. Let's get it straight away into the topic itself. I think this pointer is not working. I'll just better use the laptop itself. So maybe 2 slides on what DNB is all about. So as you might have heard, DNB is the world's leading classification society with around 15,000 employees around the globe, having 100,000 plus customers, operating in 100 plus countries, and investing 5% of its annual revenue into R&D so that we stay ahead of the curve. And as a classification society, you might have already heard about DNV in general, but DNV is also in the energy sector, providing advisory, certification, verification as well, and also into the software section, also in management systems, supply chain, and product assurance as well. So it has 20% market share as a classification society and one of the most top performing classification societies in terms of port state control performance as well. So before we start, I would like to request you to maybe get an input on how much you already know about this particular topic. So if you could just take your phones and just scan this QR code, you will be introduced to a Microsoft form. And that just includes one question: how familiar you are already, or how much, maybe knowledge cannot be quantified, but I want to understand your confidence on how much you already know about this topic, and we can just pace our session accordingly. So yes, we'll just have maybe 2 minutes for this pool, and then we'll just discuss the further topics. So can you see or scan the code properly? You might have to zoom in a bit. So if you cannot see, you can just come forward as well. So yeah, okay. Yeah, it's already in your group, so you can just maybe scan from the group itself. So may I know who is left over here so that I can just get an understanding of the whole participation? Like you guys have already done, right? Okay, then let's proceed. Okay, so I understand what the whole, and it's obvious because things keep on just changing, and having a somewhat like what is the idea, at least at this particular stage of your career, it's perfectly fine. We'll just try to understand different perspectives because the theory part is very important in this particular, but it's more important to have perspectives on your own or have your own reflections on what actually is happening. So no worries, we'll just try to gain a perspective through this session. This might not be the only session that you would require to get a clarity. You might have to read quite a lot outside the session as well, but we'll just try to maybe just clarify most of the questions that you already have relating this topic to this session. So what we'll be discussing today is to understand what drives maritime decarbonization first. So that's first and foremost the most important thing to know on why are we really maritime, like decarbonizing shipping in general. So we need to understand the key drivers. Then we'll just try to understand what the ongoing regulations are, both from the IMO side, from the country side. Like you might be already aware that EU has its own sets of regulation that shipping needs to comply with. So we'll try to understand what the regulatory aspect of this, how the whole regulatory framework is set it up. We'll also try to understand what are the different ways in which we could achieve compliance in the latest context, because things keep on changing. We might have felt one was the solution maybe a year ago, but that might have totally changed at this particular stage. And it will just keep on changing as we move forward. This is one of the biggest challenge that we are facing at these days. And then we'll also discuss, if you already might know, DNV has an annual publication called Maritime Forecast 2050, when we discuss what is exactly happening in the industry, what are the DNV's perspectives on what is happening. And it's a great report that gives you an overall idea on what exactly is happening. So I would highly recommend, and we'll just discuss what are the key findings, the implications, and what were the recommendations of the previous report that was published last year, I think somewhere in summer. Okay, so this diagram is what we believe are the key drivers or the key fundamental drivers of maritime decarbonization. You might have heard this whole thing. Shipping is highly a compliance-driven industry. So unless and until you have a regulation or a rule in place, shipping won't listen to it. Because, for example, for us to take an EV, do we need a regulation to take an EV? People just prefer comfort and just go for it. But for shipping, unless and until there is a benefit, or shipping is not for charity, right? It's business at the end of the day. So unless and until there's a regulation to meet or a policy requirement, shipping won't listen to decarbonization calls. So regulation and policy are the key drivers. So you might have already heard the updated IMO strategy, or we are going for net zero. There are other policies from the EU side. Other countries are also deciding on maybe whether they should come with policies or not. So policies and regulations are an important driver of maritime decarbonization. Also, there is an increasing demand from the financiers, because ships, like the ship owners don't just give the money out of the pockets. They just lend the money from the banks, and that's how they finance their operations in general. And who are charterers? So charterers are the ones who rent ships for their operations. So they might be cargo owners, large mining companies, large oil majors. They will be hiring ships from ship owners for their operations. There are different types of chartering, voyage chartering, time chartering. I'm not getting into the very specifics, but just try to understand. Charters also want to reduce their carbon footprint that they're causing by shipping, not just by shipping, through the other operations as well, but they want to reduce their supply chain emissions as well, of which shipping is a major part, because 80 to 90% of the global trade happens through sea, and that's through shipping itself. So most of their operations, they want to decarbonize their operations from the charter's point of view. So for that, shipping has to decarbonize. They will demand the ship owners to decarbonize their operations or have green services that they could actually use, so that they can just transport their goods, the cargo owners' goods, in a much more sustainable manner going forward. And also the financiers have their own the PR, because of the PR, because of the ESG strategies. I'm not sure how many of you are already familiar with ESG. If you could just raise your hand if you have heard the word ESG. Now, don't worry, okay, you have already heard. Okay, perfect. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance. So there is an increasing demand from companies all over the globe to learn more about, like, to have an ESG framework for their company in place. So that means the company will have to have a proper strategy in monitoring the environment performance, about the social performance, and having a proper governance structure in place. So as part of that, the environmental, which is what we are discussing right now, there's an increasing demand for these companies to reduce their carbon footprint. So how do financiers influence decarbonization? They can lend money more towards sustainable assets and not give money to people who are not sustainable in general. So that's one approach. So they will diversify their portfolio towards more sustainable assets. So in the future, or it's still happening, what is financiers are issuing sustainability linked loans, sustainability linked bonds. These are things that are really happening right now. So financiers are more interested to have sustainable ships in their lending portfolio. So financiers are also influencing shipping companies that, okay, you should be giving us your fuel consumption data, you should be sharing us your carbon footprint, and then we'll just, we'll just decide whether the lending or yes or no. Now, the whole decision of whether to lend a ship or not is strongly dependent upon its environmental credentials as well. So financiers as well as cargo owners also drive maritime decarbonization, in short. And also we need supporting frameworks and standards to support this whole thing, because simply just driving and asking them to decarbonize doesn't work. We need to have proper frameworks, standards in place to support the stakeholders or the ship owners to decarbonize their ships in general. So we are already seeing an increasing trend of alternative fuel or fuel flexibility in general. There is an increasing number of owners who are, building their new vessels with capabilities of running on alternative fuels itself. So as a matter of fact, 50%, close to 50% of the order tonnage that I'm talking about, shipyards place orders with shipyards, like for ship owners place orders with shipyards, and most of the orders that are placed or active till now, 50% out of it in terms of GT, so gross tonnage, are already alternative fuel. And in the current fleet, the penetration is quite less, but it's 6.5% of the fleet is already on alternative fuels or can run on alternative fuels, mostly LNG, and we are seeing an increasing trend for methanol as well. So we have around more than 1,000, 1,000 numbers of LNG fuel vessels, a lot of methanol fuel vessels also coming into the picture, ammonia also showing a slight trend right now. So that's what, so the industry is already transitioning or starting to transition. We are seeing that in the order books itself. So this figure you might have already seen previously as well, at least in the last 1 year. Shipping decided to go or strengthened its ambition to go for net zero by 2050. So what does that mean? So when we just speak about reductions by 50%, what do we set as a baseline? What do we set as a reference? 50% of what? So it's 2008 emissions. So whatever emissions was there, the total emissions I'm talking about, the GHG emissions in 2008 acts as the base year, and we need to go to net zero by 2050. So to make sure that it's how we travel as well. It's not just about the destination, it's about how we reach over there as well, because this influences the total amount of emission that shipping will be emitting throughout this whole period. So we cannot just, completely, go full swing on conventional fuels till 2050, 2049 and just decarbonize by 2050. That will cause more emissions. So we need to have a proper path. So indicative checkpoints have been given by the IMO. 20% on, this is on the minimum scenario. There are two different scenarios on the strategy as well, which is one is baseline minimum scenario as well as the striving for. So in the minimum scenario, we need to reduce the total emissions from shipping at least by 20% in total emissions. I'm talking about, when I just talk about total emissions, it's absolute emissions. So when I just talk about absolute emissions in the coming slides as well, that means total emissions. So whatever. So for example, 100 tons of CO2 or the, what is the shipping on an annual basis emits around maybe 800 or maybe just 100 million tons of CO2 every year. So that's the absolute emissions that I'm talking about. So we need to reduce this, whatever was there in 2008, which is approximately, 795 million tons on tons of CO2 on a well-to-wake basis, on tank-to-wake basis, which we'll get into the details on what tank-to-wake and well-to-wake is all about. But 2008 is the base year. We need to reduce it by 20%, at least by 2030, 70% in 2040, and go to net zero by 2050. So that's the whole, trajectory. And then the intensity as well. So intensity is totally different. It's not the total emissions that I'm talking about. It's the emissions per transport work. That means the capacity times whatever the distance is sailed by the vessels in general. So the transport work is what we call capacity multiplied by the distance sailed. But we'll just get into the specifics in the coming slides. So also we need to have 5% of the energy share from alternative fuels. That's also an indicative checkpoint that we have set for 2030. So now comes the whole set of terms that you might have already seen: EDI, EXI, CII, ETS, fuel maritime, carbon prices, midterm measures, GHG pricing, bunker levy, all these kinds of stuff, which ship owners will have to comply moving forward. So in the future, there's a serious challenge because currently, earlier there were no money involved with GHG emissions. People did not have a commercial impact if they don't comply. In general, energy efficiency definitely resulted in better commercial performance, but there was not direct costs associated with GHG emissions. But now GHG emissions will have a cost associated with it as well. So you might be already familiar, EU ETS or the European Union Emission Trading System. So every ton of CO2 will now have a tax associated with it. So if you burn, 1 ton of CO2, you'll have to pay around maybe $70. So your ship will just emit quite a lot of tons of CO2. So you just multiply it by 70 USD, that just comes to a significant commercial impact on the vessels. And this is just ETS. There will be fuel maritime as well, and other potential IMO midterm measures that are also going to have a commercial impact on the vessels. So there will be an increasing cost associated with GHG emissions moving forward. And also, as I mentioned, the commercial attractiveness of these ships or assets are looked forward by different indicators or KPIs, which is CII, the total GHG emissions, what is the well-to-wake GHG intensity and stuff. So all will be used to assess what is the performance or how good or how bad the vessel is in terms of sustainability. So that will be an increasing influencing factor going forward. And as I already mentioned, there is an increasing expectation from the cargo owners as well as the financial institutions to decarbonize shipping. So they will also influence or try to influence in their own ways to force ship owners to decarbonize their operations in general. So EEDI, do you know what EEDI is all about? So it's Energy Efficiency Design Index. So all new builds in general will have to comply with EEDI. It should have a minimum energy efficiency standard. It was introduced somewhere around 2013-14. So all ships that were built after 2013-14 will have to comply with EEDI. So it will just have a phased reduction as well. So it makes sure that new builds that are built in the future will be much more energy efficient than the ones that are being built right now. So that's how EEDI operates. But there's a problem. EEDI was introduced in 2013-14, right? So what about the vessels that were built before that? They did not have to think about energy efficiency or anything at all. So that's when EXI was introduced as a short-term measure, because energy efficiency was to be regulated for the existing ships as well, not just for the new ships, right? So a whole calibration exercise is what I will just call EXI, to make sure that the existing vessels, the vessels that were built before that, and also for the vessels which were built on the earlier phase of EEDI, be more energy efficient. So what was the most common measure that was used for EXI compliance, if you know? It's engine power limitation. They'll just limit the power of their engine to a level that is required for minimum compliance, and that's how they complied. Some of the owners also invested towards energy efficiency technologies, having pre-swell ducts on board, or maybe, having technical measures on board the vessels, but most of them just limited their engines, and that's how they achieved compliance in general. So that's all about EEDI and EXI. These are the energy efficiency or the technical measure. And this is only for the EXI condition or the EEDI condition, which is this, the calculations are only for 75% of the maximum continuous rating of the engine. So that's just one condition. The ship always doesn't operate in that particular condition at all. In actual operations, it will have different engine loads. So we need to have a measure to measure the actual operational emissions as well. That's why CII, or carbon intensity indicator, was introduced. So that just measures the actual emissions that will be there from the ships. The fuel consumption data will be collected by IMO DCS. All ship owners will report to IMO DCS, which is the IMO data collection system. So from 2019, all ship owners are reporting how much fuel are they consuming, what fuel are they consuming, how much, and what is the distance sailed. So all these can be used to calculate the AER or the CII in general. You can just understand AER and CII to be the same, but for cruise vessels, it's called a CG dist. The gross tonnage will be used in the denominator and not the dead weight. So if dead weight is used in the denominator, it's called AER, or if GT is used, it's called CG dist. But in general, we can just call it in the bracket of CII itself. I'll just get in the formulas maybe in the coming slide. But that's all about, EEDI, and same is an onboard manual that all ships have to keep to document on how are they going to implement energy efficiency measures on board. So it has three parts altogether. Same part one is about general introduction about energy efficiency. How are they going to, change their, onboard operations, or what are the energy efficiency measures on a general outlook. Part two discusses about how they're going to report the, the fuel consumption to IMO DCS. So the part 2 will be discussing it. And the part 3, which was introduced in 2023, discusses on how the vessels are aiming to comply with CI regulation moving forward. So it will just have a 3-year plan altogether on how these vessels are going to plan for CI compliance moving forward. So that's the 3 different parts of SEAM that you see, and carbon price. So these regulations are all from the IMO point of view. The midterm measures of the potential carbon price as well as the GHG fuel standard are under development and possibly will be entering into force from 2027, not applicable as of now, but that's something that's coming. But similar mechanisms called, okay, so DCS is reporting to IMO. So wherever you operate on a global level, you will have to report the fuel consumption data to IMO DCS. But if you operate in the EU region, that it's if one of your port calls are already in the EU, you have to report against EU MR. So EU has a separate reporting framework. So shipowners will have to report IMO DCS as well as EU MRV. So the EU related emissions will be all monitored and verified in the EU MRV regulation, and that will form the basis for ETS. So ETS, based on whatever emissions was reported to MRV, will be having a carbon tax. So ETS is emission trading system based on how much of the total emissions that you will be having in the EU region, not the whole total. I'll just get into the specifics later on, because if the start and end port are both in the EU region, 100% of the emissions will be under scope. If one of the ports are outside EU, only 50% emissions will be taken into the scope. So that's how ETS generally plays, but it's based on the MRV data that is being reported. Fuel Maritime is about the onboard GHG intensity on a well-to-wake perspective. A lot of complex words over there. Don't worry. We'll just get into the specifics. Fuel Maritime is generally about changing the onboard fuel. We'll have to move towards more sustainable fuels or fuels which are having a lesser GHG impact going forward. So that's how Fuel Maritime will. So ETS is about reducing the total emissions. And for Fuel Maritime, it's about changing the GHG intensity of the fuel that you use on board. And for Poseidon principles are the framework that financial institutions use to assess the performance of the ships in their portfolio. So major banks around the globe, around 35 to 40 banks are signatories of Poseidon principles. They will report their portfolio performance every year. You can just Google Poseidon principles and understand the annual disclosure reports and all. So they will be, the banks will be, for transparency purposes, they will be reporting their climate line performance, how well their portfolio is all about in terms of sustainability performance. So on a vessel level, they will just try to understand what is the emission profile of the vessel, what is the AER, how different it is, how deviating it is from the actual or the targets. And then based on that, based on how much loan is outstanding for these companies, a weighted average will be taken. And you just need to understand financial institutions will be reporting using the Poisson Principles framework. Sea Cargo Charter is used by the charterers. So the major charterers across the globe will be reporting to the Sea Cargo Charter framework. So they will be reporting the EEOI, Energy Efficiency Operational Indicator, which is similar to CI, but granular transport work will be taken the denominator. We'll just get into it. But just try to understand there are different frameworks that the ship owners will have to look into and the stakeholders will have to look into. And all these make, the complex regulatory framework that we have right now. So what is the penalty for non-compliance? There will be regulatory risk for sure. Charter risk, you might not get charters to rent your vessels. You might face a financial risk as well. You might not get finance from the major banks at least to resume your operations in general. So these are the most relevant risks associated with not decarbonizing your vessels in general. So MEPC 81 was the latest session of the Maritime Environmental Protection Committee. And the key decision of going for net zero was made in the previous session, which was MEPC 80. 81 did not involve any major decisions, or in general, it was just a technical meeting, submitting a few proposals on what should be the midterm measures, because short-term measures are EXI and CII, which is currently active. But from 2027, we need to have technical as well as an economic measure on top of this to make sure that the onboard GHG intensity, we slowly move to alternative fuels, and also the first movers or the ones who are already decarbonizing gets a financial incentive out of this. So midterm measures are under development. Nothing was developed. It was an interim meeting that we had in MEPC 81. But moving forward, we will be having much more clarity on what will be the midterm measures that are going to be adopted in 2027. So this will be the framework that will be used, or in the next meeting, there will be a final report on the midterm measures that will be shared on what will be the measures, or there is DNB was trying to maybe just do a comprehensive impact assessment of the midterm measures that were under proposal. We just found to understand that the cost intensity because the impact of midterm measures will be so significant that we'll have additional 17 to 40% more cost for shipping in 2030 and 85% more cost for shipping in 2050. That will be the impact these measures or the commercial measures or the midterm measures will be having towards shipping in general. So this is the whole time frame that we'll have. There will be an extraordinary MEPC meeting in autumn 2025 for the adoption of the measures, and the measures will enter into force from 2027. The CII. Now we'll get into the regulations in a bit more detail just to make sure that we are all on the same page to get onto the regulations on a much more specific way. So carbon intensity indicator, you might have already heard about this quite a lot. It's an operational measure to understand what exactly is the actual emissions or the actual GHG intensity of the operations of ships. It is something that was introduced from 1st of January 2023, last year. And all cargo ships, ro-packs, as well as cruise ships, which are above 5,000 GTs. So we can just specifically call larger than 5,000 GT to be large vessels, are already reporting IMO DCS data. So with using this IMO DCS data, we can calculate what is the CII of this particular vessel, the attained CII I'm talking about. So the annual fuel consumption. So there will be one fuel multiplied by whatever is the emission factor. So emission factor in short, if I burn 1 ton of fuel, and if the emission factor of that particular fuel is 2, that means 2 tons of CO2 will be emitted. So I'll just multiply 1 by 2. That means 2 tons of CO2 will be emitted by burning that particular fuel. So emission factor is just for us to calculate what will be the CO2 emissions and whatever context. So that is the whole relevance of emission factor. So we'll take the annual fuel consumption on whatever fuel. So if it's MGO or marine gas oil gets multiplied by its emission factor. If we have HFO, that will get multiplied by its emission factor, and we'll accumulate what is the total CO2 emissions caused by that particular vessel, divided by whatever distance was traveled by the vessel in nautical miles, as well as the capacity. So for most of the vessels, apart from cruise and ro-pack, ro-ro vessels, not the ro-ro vessels, mostly the vehicle carriers, the ro-ro, the cruise vessels, GT will be taken as a capacity over there. But for all of the vessels, dead weight will be used. And there are some specific challenges associated with the operations of certain ship types to make sure it's almost a level playing field. Correction factors are also applicable for some of the vessel types, mostly for the tankers, to make sure that, necessary emissions. There are some operations associated not with the transport work, but to store the fuel on board, associated with cooling the heating the cargo and stuff, that can be just taken away from the calculations. So not the total fuel consumption, there is a correction also possible in terms of CII. So this is the mark that you get. It's a mark. And as similar to what we used to get on our schools as well, you used to get a grade from A to E. So A means you just have a good grade. E means you're bad. C means fail almost in most of our upbringing. C is still a failure, but C is okay, somewhere in the middle in the context of CII when we talk about it. So this trajectory or this whole band just keeps on getting stricter and stricter as we move forward. The proper clarity is still there till 2026. We know how much it will reduce, but it might reduce on an even bigger intensity moving forward. So based on where this particular CII value falls in this particular graph, you will get a rating. So based on my attained CII value, I need to check where I fall into this particular graph and understand how much I just perform. And even if you get a bad grade in CII, there's no consequence for it. So what if we fail in our exams? We are just maybe asked to write a proper letter from our parents stating that my son will just improve in the next exam, and that's all. That's all that's needed. In the CII framework as well, it's the same. It's a toothless tiger. It feels like it will bite you, but it won't. There is no commercial implications to CII. If you don't comply, you need to come up with a corrective action plan. So non-compliance means if you achieve an E rating for 1 year or D rating for 3 consecutive years, you will be designated as non-compliant. You need to prepare a corrective action plan. Okay, this happened. This is the root cause. I'll just improve in the next 3 years. That's what, the progress report or maybe what's the letter from the parents. That's what we need in terms of CII. So it's a toothless tiger. It won't bite you. It might just feel a bit haunting, but it's not. At least in 2026, this will be reviewed in late 2025 or early 2026. Then the possibility is that taxation or something might be influenced on the CI framework as well. But at least as of now, there's nothing associated like a tax or a commercial impact in general. So for ETS, I already mentioned, it's not like all emissions to the Europe will be taken for the taxation purpose. If you travel from Rotterdam to Singapore, 50% of the emissions will be taken. It's the voyage is defined as port to port. So if you have an in-between port, that port will be just taken for the emission accounting. So 50% of that emissions with respect to the previous port will be just taken for in the scope. And if you travel between the EU, so to Antwerp, to Rotterdam, or a smaller voyage within the EU region itself, 100% of the emissions will be taken. So that will be the scope. And what to say, will the ship owners bear this cost? So at the end of the day, the shipping charge should be met by the cargo owner or the charterer, or depends upon the commercial agreement that is existing between the charterer and the ship owner as well. So there will be ETS getting into these clauses as well on who will bear the ETS cost. And what to say, on voyage level itself, there needs to be an assurance on how much is the emissions, so that this particular emission cost can be passed on to whoever is paying this whole emissions, the whole tax in general. So and this is not a phase-in approach. For example, if you had maybe 100 tons of CO2 as emissions, whatever falls under the ETS scope, I'm just already cleared all the 50%. The final taxable emissions are 100 tons in general. Only 40 tons needs to be taxed in this year. Next year, 70% will be taxed. And from 2026, 100% will be taxed. So it's on a phase-in approach so that the industry also gets to know you don't get hit by the bus directly, but you just slowly get hit. So the commercial impact will be slowly increasing. The cost will increase. In 2026 onwards, we'll have full impact on the ETS framework itself. So this is the basic timeline that we have. 40% will be under scope for 2024. 70% will be in 2025 and 100% for the coming years. And one important stuff. When it comes to alternative fuels, should we just make sure that we are not shifting our emissions towards the energy sector in general? Because what I'm saying is, consider an alternative fuel like ammonia. Ammonia can be produced in different production pathways. Because you can you need hydrogen, nitrogen to produce ammonia through the Haber-Bosch process. This hydrogen can be sourced through different ways. It can be renewable hydrogen, can be fossil hydrogen, which is basically produced by steam reform method of LNG in general. So there are different ways in which you can actually produce. So you should make sure that the emissions are lower over there as well. Otherwise, we will be worsening the whole party by causing more emissions than the conventional fuels. So if we don't take actions or don't have proper fuel standards, our emissions will just go to the energy sector or the fuel sector. And they'll have to they'll have higher emissions because of it. So we should not make sure. So we need to have proper fuel standards, or see on a much more specific level, see everything on a well-to-wake perspective, which I'll just get on to the next slide. So we need to have proper fuel standards to make sure that our emissions are not shifted to the energy industry. It's not about making shipping the good boy. It's about all of us being good boys. So good boys or girls. Okay, so that's why we have life cycle guidelines or life cycle assessment guidelines in place, wherein we just, for the DCS reporting as well, we were just bothered about the emissions after we combust the fuel. So we were not worried about the fuel, what happened during its production, during its transportation, during its extraction. We were not bothered about it at all. So we were only bothered about the tank to wake perspective. We need to understand what tank, well, and wake means over here. So what does well mean over here? It's an oil well. So it's a starting procedure, or the starting most process of producing a fuel in general. It'll be the extraction of the fuel in general. So it's a generalized term applicable to all fuels. It doesn't mean that all fuels should be starting from the well itself. It's just a generalized term. So that is the well. The tank is the bunker tank of the ship itself. And then the wake. Wake is what you see after the propeller. So that means tank to wake means you have the fuel in your bunker tank, you burn it, it just gets produced as a wake. So we just only take into account whatever is there after bunkering in tank to wake perspective. So like I mentioned, for the case of ammonia, we need to also take into, for not just for ammonia, but for all alternative fuels, we need to take into account the well to wake perspective as well. By well to wake, I mean starting from the extraction till the wake. That needs to be considered. Otherwise, our emissions will just shift to the energy industry in general. So this is why the fueling maritime is on a well to wake perspective. But CII, all other regulations, ETS are all still on the tank to wake perspective. So that's the whole importance of having well to wake perspective in terms of fuel assessments in general, rather than the tank to wake, which we usually have right now. So for the fueling maritime, as I mentioned, is on the well to wake perspective. It's about reducing the GHG intensity or the well to wake GHG intensity of the fuels on board gradually. So 2% reduction is required from 2025. It just keeps on reducing till 18.23 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoules in 2050. But this is not aligned with the net zero targets of IMO. A recalibration might happen in the coming future because this was introduced much before IMO decided to go for net zero. This might change, but the whole purpose is that ETS needs to reduce the overall emissions, and fueling maritime will drive the alternative fuel adoption, or maybe shore powers or wind propulsion in general, because there are incentives if you go for shore power and wind propulsion in general. So that's how the whole theory behind fueling maritime. You just need to understand what these regulations are meant for, not into the very specific details on what the GHG intensity is all about, what is considered as the reference point. The reference point is important. What is it, 2020 emissions or the average GHG intensity at that particular point of time was considered to be the reference or the baseline on which we are reducing our emissions in general. So that is also something that's important. I mentioned Poisson Principle and Chicago Charter. These are the frameworks that financial institutions, as well as the charters or cargo owners, use to report their portfolio, or what to say, portfolio activity emissions in general. So it's a method of transparency to show the industry that how well they are, how well they are reducing their footprint in general. So it's a transparency mechanism that we have in the industry. So I have a question for you. One more. This is the last question. I need to get your opinion on what fuel do you believe will be part dominating the fuel mix in 2030 as well as in 2050? So I think the same approach, you can just put it in the group so that we can just scan it. So there are different options. So in the fuel mix, there will be some alternative fuels in 2030 as well, and in 2050 as well. So what do you believe will be the major fuels to be utilized in 2030 and 2050? Then we'll just start the discussions on top of that. So if you didn't understand the question or maybe what the context is, just feel free to ask. I'm happy to answer. Oh, so like the interconnectivity good. So you're already done, right? Okay. So done. Anyone is left? Left. You can't see it. It's in the group actually. Oh, so I think the percentages will almost remain the same. It's not going to change from a simple response altogether. So, okay. So in 2030, we have an increasing support for LNG as well as ammonia. Oh, for hydrogen as well. So, okay. And 2050, there's a lot of support for hydrogen as well as nuclear and ammonia as well. Okay, so we can close the poll, right? There's no one else left to maybe just poll. So now we'll just get into the bit of the specifics. I won't be getting into all fields in much details and all, but we need to understand what's the current status as of now. So do you already know what fuel is being used on board ships right now? The conventional fuels I'm talking about. Yeah, heavy fuel oil, marine gas oil, marine diesel oil. These are the conventional ones. Because of the sulfur cap, BLSFO, very low sulfur fuel oil, is also being used, or a combination of HFO plus scrubber is being used for compliance. But these are the major ones, or the conventional ones. Availability is very good. Infrastructure and storage is already global. Maturity of technology is already there. Energy density is very good. Price is also very favorable, but the green credentials are not that good. Right? That's the whole reason why we are talking about decarbonization. It's a heavily fossil fuel dependent industry. So we'll have to think going out of this whole base work as well. But we can see that no other fuel will have a comparative advantage over other points yet. For LNG, we are already seeing an increased availability altogether. Bunkering infrastructures are coming all around the globe. Infrastructure storage is developing. It's the most, what to say, I'll just get into the full point whether LNG is called as an alternative fuel or not later on, but maturity of technology is already there. Energy density would require more space on board for having LNG as fuel, approximately maybe 1.6 to 2 times more space than the fossil fuel equivalent on board. So that is just wasted cargo space, right? So cargo space is money. So the ship owner will have to maybe just compensate a few onboard space to have LNG as a fuel. So energy density is a problem. Price was too high in 2022. Now it's okay, but the green credentials. So how confident are you on the green credentials of LNG? Is LNG a fossil fuel? LNG is a fossil fuel. So it's mostly produced. The LNG that we see around us, natural gas, is mostly from fossil sources itself. Anything that's from fossil won't solve the story, wouldn't solve the problem. Because why are we just talking about phasing out from fossil fuels? Because it's a carbon cycle, right? There is constant exchange of carbon that is happening around us, but these are just sources and things. Always these exchanges are happening. But when we just burn fossil fuel, we just bringing up carbon, which was deposited millions of years ago. That just increases the CO2 concentration or the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, which will trap more heat, which is coming from the sun in the Earth's atmosphere. That's why burning fossil fuels will increase the carbon concentration in the atmosphere, or GHG concentration in general. And that's how fossil fuels should be phased out. That's why the whole argument of climate change is about phasing out fossil fuels. So LNG, if you still use it from fossil sources, it does give maybe 20% reduction in emissions in general on the tank to wake perspective. But on the well to wake perspective, it just becomes not, it's almost equivalent to maybe having, normal LNG itself. The difference of to be considered as an alternative fuel is not possible if it's from fossil sources itself. But there are possibilities that you could have bio LNG or e-LNG or sustainable LNG from other sources as well. For example, anaerobic digestion of municipal waste, or maybe that can be used to produce and liquefy as bio LNG. That's one pathway that is possible. And then you can also produce LNG, e-LNG from NG synthesis as well. So that's from renewable hydrogen and stuff. So if you go for bio LNG or e-LNG, that's sustainable. That's very good. That can be considered as a potential alternative fuel, but fossil LNG, better not to. It's still a fossil fuel, so it can be used as a transition fuel, but not the ultimate solution. So when I just talk about this fossil definition of alternative fuels, that is applicable to the other ones as well. If we are just talking about fossil ammonia, that means the feedstocks or the things that we use to make this fuel is from fossil sources. That is not going to help. Fossil ammonia, fossil methanol, fossil hydrogen is not going to help. In short, we need sustainable fuels. Sustainable fuels in the sense it should be either having a bio pathway or a renewable energy pathway or electricity pathway in general, in short. So for LNG, we are seeing an increasing number of orders in terms of container ships, mostly LNG carriers use it as a fuel, itself because it's a cargo already. So the infrastructure is already there on board, but specialized fuel tanks will be there. But the adoption of LNG is mostly towards the LNG carriers, LNG carrier ships itself in general. And we are seeing a lot of orders for LNG container ships as well, placed on LNG itself. LPG. LPG is also having, what to say, it's a byproduct of maybe crude oil refining as well as natural gas synthesis. But LPG is not much different from LNG when it comes to greenhouse gas credentials in general. And it's something that's still a lot more focused on the LPG carriers rather than it has not seen much penetration towards other segments that we are talking about. So LPG is still something that's confined to the LPG carriers and not to other segments as an alternative fuel in general. For methanol, we are seeing an increasing number of orders. One of the major container lines are already announced their support towards, or maybe they're quite bullish on methanol in general. I'm talking about Maersk, if you know. So the availability same case that I've explained for fossil cases. Fossil methanol is never a solution. You have more emissions than the conventional fuel. So why shift to fossil methanol? But green methanol is highly expensive. It cannot be afforded. And that's why we just talk about the availability of green methanol is still not there. And the price is also a very red flag. It cannot be afforded to operate on a profitable basis these days in general. So methanol is the same case for biofuels. What is the advantage that biofuels have? If you could just know. Do we need any infrastructure or what to say, retrofits on board the vessels to operate on biofuels? No, you can be loud because you won't come on the cameras. Biofuel is a drop-in fuel. Drop-in fuel means it can be used on board the vessels without any modifications. When I say any, it's on an asterisk sign. Small modification would be required on the subsystems, but biofuels can be generally used as a drop-in fuel directly with the the vessels that are already operating on conventional fuels. There is not, but for operating on ammonia, for operating on LNG, for operating on methanol, you would require retrofits. You need specific engines to operate on these gas fuels. But for biofuels, it's already similar in properties to maybe the normal conventional fuels that we have. And it's a drop-in fuel mostly. So 100% people are just piloting 100% of biofuels on board their vessels and hasn't reported major problems altogether. But there are some problems, or biofuels cannot be stored for a long time. The oxidative, oxidative degradation will be there. It cannot be stored for a long time. So we cannot and it will just react with the onboard components, some of them, because it's bio, right? So obviously degradation will be there and stuff like that. But do you know why biofuels are considered sustainable, or why biofuels? Because if you burn biomass, you'll have carbon emissions, right? Why is it considered as potential alternative fuel in shipping? Yes, please. Yeah, but I'm talking about the tank to wake perspective. I'm not talking about the well to wake perspective, only on the tank to wake. When we get biofuels and we just burn it, there are carbon emissions. But the whole catch is that biofuels are from biomass, right? It can be from, or okay. When I talk about biofuels, I need to explain the three categories of biofuels as well: first generation, second generation, third generation, and there exists fourth generation as well. So for the first generation, food or maybe potentially food crops can be used as biofuels. But there is a sustainability problem over there. Will you prioritize poverty or maybe hunger, something that's still haunting us, but will you use food as fuel? It's a whole debate. So first generation biofuels, or the practice of using food directly as a fuel, is not something that's sustainable, right? There are other issues to address than just carbon emissions, right? Survival always, or over sustainability. So that's the whole reason why we just mentioned biofuels. First generation biofuels to be not sustainable. Second generation, which are waste, vegetable oils, forest residues, can be considered as sustainable because these are already wasted. And the whole principle is that biofuels have already, because of biomass, because of photosynthesis, will already absorb a lot of carbon. And the whole funda is that when we just burn these biofuels, this emission is actually getting over. And this is something that was collected in the short term. It was not submerged millions of years ago. So there's not much of a damage that is created on the cycle. In general, that's why we just call biofuels as sustainable. Sustainable biofuels should be used. That means mostly second generation or third generation or fourth generation. Third generation mostly from algae, fourth generation is even advanced biofuels. So anything apart from the first generation biofuels, we just call it as advanced biofuels. And advanced biofuels can be considered as sustainable in general. So that's the whole principle of biofuels. But the availability as well as the price, it's not something that's favorable these days because since it's a drop-in fuel, everyone can use biofuels for compliance. They don't have to do an onboard retrofit to use biofuels. But the price factor is definitely there. People don't use biofuels purely. They just blend it with a conventional fuel and reduce. Yeah. So where were we? Okay, but biofuels, so the second generation and third generation can be considered as advanced biofuels, and that can be considered as sustainable in general. So for ammonia, the whole process is there. We need to make sure it's from green sources, it's from renewable electricity or from the bio sources to make sure that it's sustainable. The green credentials, fossil ammonia won't work. And for ammonia, there are increasing concerns of toxicity, and the handling of ammonia is not that safe. It is highly toxic on short concentrations and even on higher concentrations, it can be, it can cause severe problems or to human. So there's a whole lot of other risk as well in terms of ammonia. Engines are still developing. We might have commercial engines in 2027. There are quite a lot of orders being placed, and we'll have few ammonia vessels as well in the later part of this decade in general. For hydrogen, we would, storage is complex as well as it's quite expensive. It's hard to meet the commercial aspects when we just use hydrogen. We would ideally need 6 times more cargo capacity or like fuel tank capacity than the conventional fuel tank sizes that we have. So it will just take a lot more space. The storage of hydrogen is a complicated case, but something that is definitely a great choice for the long term, possibly. So we talked about alternative fuels, but we need to understand how much is available already. As part of the Maritime Forecast 2050 exercise, we just tried to map out all the different carbon neutral projects around the globe. We just mapped around 2,200 carbon neutral projects around the globe. And then we just try to understand, okay, these are the places where carbon neutral fuels are available. When we just calculated the whole capacity or how much fuel can be produced by these facilities in general, we just understood that, can you see this particular light green thing over here? So this will be the amount of carbon neutral fuels that will be produced by all these facilities, but shipping would require 30 to 40% of the carbon neutral fuels for its compliance. So in 2030, we have a target of 5% energy share should be from alternative fuels, but we don't have enough alternative fuels to meet the target. We will need 30 to 40% of that amount. Only 40 million tons oil equivalent to 60 million oil ton equivalents would be produced. Shipping annually has a fuel demand of approximately 280 million tons oil equivalent. So to have at least 5%, that means 17 million ton oil equivalent, we would need a fair portion of that. And that is approximately 30 to 40%. And shipping only takes 3% right now. 3% of the total energy demand is only being taken by shipping. And a guy who is just taking 3% right now, demanding 30 to 40% in 2030 would be unrealistic. We won't have enough carbon neutral fuels moving forward. That's the reason why we need to work on energy efficiency. We need to reduce the amount of energy that we require for our needs, for shipping needs. So a lot of portion can be taken by carbon neutral fuels, but a huge portion has to be taken by energy efficiency as well. We need to reduce the amount of energy that we need for our operations. So energy efficiency plus carbon neutral fuel can definitely help us reach net zero by 2050. But yeah, that's the challenge. We need a combination of both. That highlights the importance of energy efficiency measures, which is a combination of operational, technical, and other measures as well. So in short, all measures needs to be adopted. It's not just about changing the fuel. We don't have enough fuel. We need to reduce the energy demand that is required on board. So it just starts with the logistic and digitalization. We need to speed reduction. It has a commercial impact as well. When does okay, so when the markets are really good, when you get higher freight rates for your operations, will you just try to slow down or operate as fast as possible and get as much money as possible? You will try to speed up and execute as many trades as possible so that you could make the most amount of profits. And especially in a condition like this, wherein CI doesn't bite you. CI doesn't have any commercial impact. This is a phase wherein we don't have to pay money for non-compliance. So speed reduction should be actually matched with the market performance as well. We should be finding a sweet spot rather than reducing the speed by 2-3 knots in general. That should not be the case. It should always be a balance between how the markets, because that's much more realistic approach rather than just saying that reduce your speed. Reducing your speed, obviously EXI has already limited most of the engines. Already the vessels are already going on a slower speed, but the ideal speed should be always a focus between the markets, because the shipping company, as I already mentioned, shipping is not for charity. It's to make as much money as possible, but on a compromise. And the vessel utilization, because always you need to minimize port waiting times as much as possible. You need to be on sailing times as much as possible so that the vessels or the assets or the fleet generally is utilized properly. You need to have the right vessel size for the right trade, because shipping companies in general will have a lot of vessels in their fleet. They need to properly optimize on which vessel needs to be executing what trade, because that will also have, because larger vessels will have lesser AER ratings in general. So on a fleet level, that reduces more emissions, but it's always a mix and match with a lot of other factors as well. And alternative routes. You know about the Red Sea crisis, right? So what is the Red Sea crisis? Because of the Houthis attack, ships cannot go through the Suez Canal right now. It will have to take a whole round around Africa, around Cape of Good Hope, and that is approximately 3,500 nautical miles more than the usual transit. So it's about survival, because you cannot risk your vessel to be attacked, so you'll just pay a higher insurance premium altogether, but you cannot risk your vessel. So you'll have to go for a higher route, but that is causing more GHG emissions. So ideally, we should be finding the route which is most optimal for decarbonization. But when this disruptions like Red Sea crisis or the Panama Canal crisis, there's severe droughts in Panama canals. So the number of vessels that could actually transit through the Panama Canal is also restricted. It was around 34 ships per day, but now it's currently 24. Less 10 ships less than the normal traffic that we see through the Panama Canal. So alternative routes should be chosen according to whatever is having lesser GHG emissions. In general, hydrodynamic factors will also always influence, because when most of the vessels were designed, energy efficiency was not at all a priority. It was just designing a vessel. Even in your final projects, we don't just optimize the resistance as much as possible, or maybe just go for energy efficient devices. So hydrodynamics, hull coating. The hull friction can be reduced as much as possible by having low friction paints or ultra low friction paints, which can either be silicone or foul releasing paints. Air lubrication systems wherein flat bottomed hulls are there. Hull cleaning as well, because there'll be an increasing risk of biofouling if you expose the hull to seawaters. Seawater is highly corrosive. There will be species that gets attached to the hull, which actually causes increased resistance altogether. So we should be cleaning the hull on a frequent basis. This is what vessel performance teams also actually do. They just set a baseline on what exactly should be the ideal performance of the vessel. And if it just deviates beyond a point, they'll just try to see or look after the KPIs to see whether the hull is severely fouled or not. So visual inspection or something. They can have digital tools as well to maybe just monitor on how foul the hull is, but that's how hull cleaning generally works. You need to optimize the timing of hull cleaning to make sure that the hull is not found. And especially when you travel in the tropical waters, it will be warmer waters. Warmer waters, you will be much more exposed to biofouling than in the normal icy waters or the normal temperature waters in general. There will be machinery improvements also required. So machinery efficiency improvements, waste heat recovery, engine derating, so battery hybridization, fuel cells, and most importantly, the fuels as well. But as I mentioned, we won't have enough fuels for our needs. So it's always about a combination about energy efficiency measures and the fuels. After treatment, we estimate still, since we don't have enough carbon neutral fuels moving forward, a lot of fossil fuel vessels will still be there in 2050. So what will these vessels do? They'll have to capture this carbon and offload it in a proper facility altogether. And that should be used either for sequestration under the ground or for you to be utilized on other sectors as well. So that is why carbon capture will also see a lot of relevance moving forward. So energy efficiency will be the key to remain competitive, because I was just checking the message as well. So energy efficiency is key to remain competitive. It's not just about reducing the emissions, but also it just reduces the amount of fuel that you require. So what happens when you reduce the amount of fuel? You need lesser amount of money for fuel prices. Like the fuel cost will also reduce, right? So if you need lesser fuel for your operations, your operational costs will also come down. So it's also about a cost competitiveness as well. It's a combination of operational measures, which is squeezing out the remaining potential of the assets without doing much modifications to the vessels. You need to improve your operations as much as possible. Technical measures, which is additional modification, which can be involving hydrodynamic or machinery improvements to the vessels, commercial and logistics. So speed reduction should be considered whenever it's possible. So when you already know that you will be having a huge waiting time in ports, there is no requirement that you should be sailing fast and then waiting. The industry designed in a way that it should be sailing fast and wait, because there are principles like demurrages that the charterer will have to pay the ship owner if the charterer takes a lot more time than what was agreed in the contracts. So the owner will be getting the demurrages. So to get this on place, the ship owners will be speeding the vessels to reach the ports, releasing the notice of readiness, and just waiting for the charterer to pay the demurrages in general. So that's how the industry is designed. That's one of the major challenges that the industry is facing right now. It's not designed for decarbonization. It's the opposite. So we need to make sure that commercial agreements also, we discuss with the charterers on what exactly should be the ideal speed, whether it's a problem that if the cargo reaches a bit slower, but it would be lesser speeds means lesser emissions in general. So that's also something that we need to consider. Alternative fuels also will always remain a key part of this puzzle. So operational measures involve optimizing the machinery on board, optimizing the hydrodynamic performance, optimizing the efficiency during its operations as well, while in operation as well as in ports. Technical measures, machinery and systems, propulsion, hydrodynamic efficiency improvements, alternative energy sources, and digital tools on board as well. So digitalization is not a regulation, right? It's something that ship owners actually do on a proactive level. There is no mandate that you should be having telemetric systems on board. You should be digitally monitoring your tool. Still, it's okay if you monitor your fuel consumption and all manually as well. So through sounding methods, obviously. So these are different options that we could just potentially consider, but I'm not getting into the details, but it's just about highlighting the emphasis that we need to place towards energy efficiency measures in general. So you might have already seen, ducts, fins, rudders being designed. So why are we just, having ducts in place? Because for higher CB vessels, at least for the initial years, you might not be familiar what CB is all about, but yeah, the introduction to naval architecture, you're already studying it, right? The blow coefficient. So the blow coefficients will be higher for the bulk carriers as well as the tankers. So the inflow towards the propeller would not be ideal. So we need a duct to make sure that the rotational efficiency of the propeller as well as what is the inflow towards the propeller is right. So we need to have ducts in place. Fins are also something, hull fins are also an increasing practice right now. The propeller design or retrofit. The propeller will be designed for an ideal speed range during the design stage itself. But where the vessel is operating right now, because of its operational profile, might be totally different. It might be quite less. So we need to redesign the propeller to make sure that it's optimized to the conditions that it's operating. So it should be optimized. So a lot of owners find a lot of sense to maybe retrofit a new propeller on board the vessels, which is optimized towards, and also this applies to the engine derating as well, because in most cases where energy efficiency was not talk of the town, people used to have very large engines with higher powers, which were compatible with higher speeds. But now, since most of the industry has slowed down their operations, the ideal conditions of the engines might not be there. So we need to redesign or derate the engines permanently, either by cylinder cutoff or maybe turbocharger cutoff in general, and redesign the propeller as well together. So the hydrodynamic efficiency improvements, air lubrication is one technology that is to reduce maybe the important point to note is that all measures are not applicable for all vessel types. There will be some measures which are much more efficient for some segments, and there will be measures which are applicable to the other segments as well. For example, bow enhancements. We designed the bulbous bow for, at least for the senior guys over here, you might be already familiar. The bulbous bow is designed for a particular speed range. And that speed range might not be the one that the vessel might be operating right now. It might. So there makes a whole lot of sense to redesign the bow, especially for the vessels which are going at higher speeds, especially the containers. In general, it makes a lot of sense to, redesign the bow in general. So That's one thing. So I just mentioned about the bulbous move, but this is applicable to the other measures as well. Some measures are much more compliant or better for some vessel types. All measures won't work at all ships in general. So we might have to consider reduce the demand of alternative fuels. So we might have to consider alternative energy sources as well in our mix. And for improving operations, we need to have proper performance management softwares. But this is something that the owners will be doing on a proactive basis and not mandated by regulation. So as I already mentioned, shipping is already a compliance driven. So the early movers or the large companies which are having its own economies of scale will implement digital technologies across its fleet. But the small to medium sized owners might not have already used these technologies for maximum utilization. And charter negotiations, because the charter might not directly care. We might work with charters who might not directly care about energy efficiency, but we need to make this part of the charter negotiations as well to make sure that energy efficiency is being discussed. We just go for the most optimized, whether it is in terms of the speed decision altogether. If we already know that we are going to wait in the end port. It's better that we go for an optimized speed rather than just sail fast. So these all things should be taken into account while during the charter negotiations itself. So what was discussed in the Maritime Forecast 2050 report that DNV publishes every year? So the last publication was somewhere around maybe September 2023. It's been always a month, and in a couple of months, you can expect the next version as well. So the previous version, IMO has already strengthened its targets. We will require approximately 30 to 40% of the carbon neutral fuels that are going to be produced in 2030. Half the order tonnage can already run on alternative fuels in terms of million GT in those tonnage and not in the number of vessels. So global fuel production standards are required because I mentioned we should not be pushing our emissions to the energy industry. We should be not solely focused on our industry, but also focused on the energy industry as well. So we need global production standards in place to make sure that our emissions are not getting shifted to other industries in general. And we have also given cases wherein onboard carbon capture and nuclear propulsion can also be economical options, but the detailed calculations is something that you could just find in the report itself on what are the assumptions, what are the models that we need to follow, and what are the key economic parameters that needs to be considered. So what does this imply, or what does it mean? We have just stated that this is what is happening right now. Fuel producers must now accelerate the fuel production of carbon neutral fuels because we won't be having it enough, at least on the announced projects as of now, but we need to accelerate the fuel production in general. So that's what it means for the fuel producers. Reducing energy consumption is not just a talk of the town, but it's something that we need to do because we won't be having enough carbon neutral fuels to make sure that we comply with the regulations of the IMO and other stakeholders. So, and something that should not be forgotten is the influence of seafarers, because come on, we just have all these technologies, but there should be people who should be properly trained to make sure that they can operate these vessels in the first place, because all these alternative fuels will have its own complexities in terms of operations. So seafarers should not be forgotten. They should be trained properly and have the proper certifications to operate these vessels, which are going to come in the future. And further regulatory clarity should be there because regional regulations are there, IMO regulations are there. A lot different things are being requested, but it makes the thing a lot more complex for the ship owners in general. So a much more clarity and standardization should be there in terms of regulations and where we are heading. And also the cost of decarbonization is not something that's only for the ship owner. It should be passed on throughout the value chain. And at the end of the day, it will come to us because things that we buy will get more expensive and we'll pay the whole cost of decarbonization. So are we willing to pay that additional cost for greener transportation service is also a question. So, but that's something that should be driving this whole initiative. So what are the key recommendations? We need to reduce energy consumption at the soonest possible. It's not just about what to say. It will just definitely have a commercial impact. There will be good ROIs on good projects, negative abatement costs on a lot of measures as well. And all measures should be considered. It's not just about, I'll only go for this. No, you'll have to consider everything as a whole to make sure that you comply with the regulations that are coming on forward. And things are changing quite a lot because owners just went for LNG fuel vessels when the sulfur cap was introduced, because LNG was mostly introduced as a fuel to go for the sulfur regulations. But then when GHG regulations or the well-to-wake perspective came, it just became a challenge again. So the designs that we have or the owners will invest in the future should be having fuel flexibility, or you should be designing it in a way that there is enough capacity on board to maybe just do a possible retrofit in the future, so that you can just convert your LNG engines to an ammonia engine in the future, or methanol engine, or whatever the fuel of the future is, or whatever makes a lot more economic sense, that can be designed or retrofitted on board the vessels. And always consider the long-term fuel strategy. You should be having a constant pathway, because if you are an owner who is actually burning fossil LNG, the pathway should be, without retrofit, should be to move towards bio LNG or e-LNG moving forward. If you are what is a conventional fuel vessels, you could just consider biofuels, or maybe potentially, if other conditions are okay and the vessel is quite young enough, you could potentially consider ammonia or methanol retrofits, considering the bore size of the engine is 50 centimeter and more, or it's an electronically controlled engine, which I'm not getting into the specifics, but a lot of things have to be met for making sure that you design that long-term strategy in general. So the conclusion is that energy efficiency should be prioritized. It's not just about reducing the emissions, but also about cost competitiveness moving forward. Because green fuels in the future will be expensive. So every energy that you save right now will be worth it in the future when the prices are so high. You will have a cost advantage over there when you just implement energy efficiency at the soonest possible. Because when it gets delayed, you will have lesser life remaining out of the vessel. You won't be getting out the returns from the investments that you already make. So what is the return that we actually get from the investments? For example, I just put a propeller duct on board my vessel. What is the savings that I have? It's a fuel price savings, or the fuel savings in general, because that will save. I would have maybe just bought a lot more fuel if that was not there. So the fuel quantity that I save multiplied by the fuel price scenario is the savings that I get. And also I would have had to pay the carbon tax as well. So that also comes into the mixer. And also the additional compliance cost is the savings that I get. So if the vessel is as young as possible, and if I implement it as early as possible, I'll get more returns out of it, rather than when the vessel is just 5 years more down to be scrapped in 5 years. It does not make sense to maybe invest on a lot high capex measures in general. So ship owners should take immediate measures on energy efficiency, and the major investments will pay back, because the fuel prices in the future will just increase. So even if you just go for high capex measures or high capex energy efficiency measures, it would be still worth it, considering the fuel prices would be higher moving forward. So that was mostly about what I wanted to discuss. So hope you had at least a bit more perspectives coming into your mind, a lot more clarity than what you had. And maybe if I just put that poll once again, I'm strongly believe that you will just say familiar than somewhat. Yes, that's all from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Aravind, for your inspiring words. Next, we will have a question and answer section. If you have any queries, please feel free to ask.
Yes, that's a good question, because as I mentioned, this just falls into the energy efficiency part as well, because we need alternative power sources as well, which includes solar. But solar, I don't want to vote for, or maybe just endorse any technologies over here, but everything works on a abatement cost perspective. For example, this measure will have a capex associated with it. There is an amount of savings that you could potentially have, for example, 5%, 6%, whatever be it. So we need to properly calculate whether it makes a commercial sense to just go for a particular measure or not. So what do we define a KPI called abatement cost. That means how much money will we have to put in to save 1 ton of CO2. So this is a KPI that we could use. And if it makes commercial sense to go for these measures, yes. And since I mentioned carbon neutral fuels won't be available, we'll have to consider additional energy sources as well. But we need to consider the limitations, because wind propulsion cannot be employed at all ship types in all routes as well. So, and it's a high capex measure altogether. It will just cost quite a significant amount of money. And it's something that's recommended mostly towards the new build or the younger vessels in general, because that will have enough time to get back the money that we have invested predominantly. So for the existing vessels, which are quite old vessels, no, but for the new build vessels, it makes a lot of sense to make, because we might have, for the wind propulsion system, I think we have around 20 to 30 vessels which are already adopting this wind propulsion systems on board, whether it's a flattener rotor, or maybe wing sails in general. There are people who are going for this, but at the end of the day, money matters. If it makes sense for the specific vessel, they cannot be generalized trends. But on a generalized trend, I can just still say it will be part of the mix. We need to consider, but at the end of the day, the commercial wins at all games, unless it's a matter of policy that the company wants to try out something. So did that answer your question? Yeah. No, please don't call me Sasu. You can call me Vani. No, shipowners don't just make vessels for 15 years. In short, but like the usual period of a ship, like mostly on conventional vessels, would be 25 years. Or like for LNG carriers, it can actually go according. But now the period of scrapping will also depend upon how stricter the decarbonization regulations are going to get. So there will be not. It's about having a proper strategy, because it depends upon, okay, for the bulk carrier, it depends upon where the owner is based on. So the availability of fuels in the routes that the vessel operates or is expected to operate. So if there is good domestic production of biofuels, or if it's for mostly the coastal operations and stuff. So it depends upon the operations, the commercial sense, and also the long-term strategy. If it's about having a future-proof plan, which is highly tough at this stage, but we'll have to consider a lot of options. And we just look at the total cost of ownership. What will be the total cost of ownership, considering a lot of assumptions, and just see which place a much better, which is much more commercially attractive altogether. So because going for dual fuel vessels would be a good thing to do, because these dual fuel vessels can operate on 100% conventional fuel as well as alternative fuels. So going for example, if it's about future proofing, even for example, if I just take about LNG engines in general, what type of engine technology you go for is also important, because methane slip. I did not discuss about methane slips, right? So there will be some unburnt methane that is going out of the LNG engines, which needs to be considered. And this personally strongly depends upon the engine technology that we use, whether it's a diesel cycle slow speed engine, whether it's a Otto cycle slow speed engine, medium speed engine, or LBSI steam turbines. This will have different percentages of methane slips. Methane is a greenhouse gas, which is 27 times more potent than CO2 in general. So 1 ton of methane will have an impact of 27 tons of CO2. So that's an important consideration. And the same is the case for ammonia as well. There will be nitrous oxide emissions, which is 264 times more potent than 1 ton of CO2. So the engine technology that you choose in terms of LNG would be more important. And whether it depends upon the specific case. We'll have to look into the specifics where the vessel is expected to operate and stuff. And it's a comprehensive approach that we'll have to go for on what fuel needs to be. But it's about having a long-term plan. There are obviously pathways that you could consider. There is no one way. If it's about LNG, you could just possibly consider biofuels as well as ELNG, bioLNG moving forward. But what composition will be there depends upon the price. If, for example, in 2022, the LNG prices were so high, all the LNG powered vessels operated mostly on fossil fuels itself, not on fossil fuels, on conventional MGO, MDU itself, because it made a lot more commercial sense for it to not operate on LNG. There was no incentive if you just went for LNG, unless it's for SOX compliance. There was no other incentive for decarbonization when you just go for LNG in general. So it just depends upon a lot of specific factors. I cannot just maybe comment on, but it is just quite owner specific and just a trade specific in general. Yeah. Yeah, already, because what do you say? New building, when just companies, all people just like to play the wait and see game. They want to see what other people are going for, and then just maybe having a proper plan. So it's very hard for the ship owners to maybe just come up with a proper what to say, a proper plan on what should be the fuel for the renewables. And this is the challenge. And there should be a synchronization of all the regulations moving forward, because you cannot have multiple, you will have a tax on the global level, you will have tax on the regional level. This just keeps on adding up. So we need to have a synchronization as well. But considering that a fuel pathway is not existing at the moment, yeah. So it depends. There should be a synchronization for sure, but it's about, yeah, the new building orders are definitely facing a challenge, and most of the people are waiting. And if the markets are good, they will just go for fossil fuel, or maybe like still people are going for conventional fuel vessels as well, but considering a biofuel pathway. But yeah, it depends upon the market demand and how the pricing scenarios will go in the forward, in moving forward.
We have discussed about various fuels in the presentation, like ammonia, methanol, etc. And can we extend the scope nuclear and fuels in these comparisons?
Yes, yes, we definitely can, because we have already maybe just given, what to say, in the last Maritime Forecast 2050 publication, we just gave a feasible option for nuclear as well, but not maybe in the short term, but in the later part of 2030s, and maybe we definitely will see a lot more uptake of nuclear as well, because it's already applied in defense sector already. Nuclear is already a fuel, but how much sense it makes for the commercial shipping is on the commercial as well. So the capex, the initial capex that will have to be involved, and it's not just about the compliance part. Over here, it's a lot of political on the deposition of nuclear waste. There's a lot of other factors which needs to have a lot of support from the policy side as well for nuclear to be considered as a suitable option. So it there needs to be a lot of political and regulatory changes as well for nuclear to be adopted as a fuel. But yeah, if it makes a commercial sense, definitely.
Thank you.
That white paper was released, but still, what to say? I think on the policy level, it's still being discussed on what can be done on coastal shipping. Uh, it's the whole problem is there is no silver bullet on what can be done, but we are working with quite a lot of people, owners in general, on how they can just decarbonize their fleets itself. But nothing has proceeded from that. But still, we are just still collecting inputs. And on the policy level, still the DG Shipping is actually calling for a lot of meetings from the stakeholders to understand what can be exactly done. So
If anyone attending this seminar via Zoom meeting have any doubts, they can ask by unmuting their mics.
Thank you, Arvind, for that insightful presentation. Just wanted to have a quick take on what's DNV's take on blue ammonia. What do you because there's at the moment there's no harmonized regulations for how you consider blue ammonia and emissions from blue ammonia. Do you have any view on that?
okay. Can you please repeat the question?
So I was just asking, do you have or does DNV have a view on blue ammonia? Blue ammonia being it is sourced from fossil
Yeah, the
fuel.
fossil
It is
ammonia plus
CO2.
carbon capture in general. So
Yep.
definitely. So we, except from the fossil fuel pathway, we just say yes to all other pathways, which are much more sustainable than the conventional options. Because yes, it just takes away the whole well to tank on carbon capture, and definitely it's about having land-based CCUS systems on board. So definitely it's definitely one of the solutions, because if we don't have enough green renewable electricity for our green fuel production demand, it's definitely something that we'll have to consider as part of the mix.
Right, but the question was more on how do you certify what is blue ammonia?
Yeah, okay. So that's mostly from the certification point of view itself. It's totally out of scope from us as a classification
Okay.
society advisory point of view. So yeah, there should be proper field certifications on what classifies, or there should be a proper audit on the whole fuel production pathway as well. And I think the bunker delivery notes might have the well to wake intensity already stated, whether it's blue. So it's up to the fuel certification organizations to maybe just state the proper well to wake intensity that will be directly used for the calculations, because it might not make sense for the classification or the ROs who are verifying these emissions to go till the fuel production stage to verify. But it's up to the fuel certification organizations or the fuel certifiers or the bunker suppliers to maybe just properly account for the well tank emissions of these fuels in general.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Arvind. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can.
Yeah. Arvind, I see that, when the data collection started, maybe in 2008, data, and until 2019, or from IMO, DCS, EUMRV. So you see that this is progressing, and that also gave a good guidance how we should proceed. How do you change this collection of data is evolving as far as the decarbonization is concerned. Tomorrow, what we need to collect, and what is the challenge for the ship owners from a cost point of view?
The question was mostly pertaining to the data collections, the IMO DCS, and what should be the granularity of the collection. Did I get it correctly?
Yeah. We today we got enough data, but we still lack some of them, because for the small ship owners, they can't invest a lot to collect all these data. Because if you want for example, instead of a known reporting versus having a high frequency data from your ship, so how do you see this evolving in the sector?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's a lot of limitations because of the current reporting frameworks that we already have. DCS just takes into the account the overall fuel consumption, the emission factors, and everything on the tank to wake perspective, and also on the transport work. It's not the actual one. It is something, because the actual cargo carried by these vessels might be totally different from it. It's definitely not the deadweight, the maximum capacity, but somewhere between less. So the actual transport work. And last MEPC meeting also had maybe an emphasis on increasing the granularity of the DCS reporting that we already have. So yes, it's definitely a challenge for ship owners to maybe, even the current reporting itself is creating a lot of havoc for the ship owners. And now, since we have a lot of, because it will be just submergence of the MRV reporting, DCS reporting altogether, there needs to be a higher call on synchronization, all these reporting frameworks. But that's why DNV came up with the OVD reporting framework altogether, which is a standardized framework that could be used for any regulation. So we already collect the data that is required for all, because there's a standard template. If you just go to DNV, if you just search Google on DNV OBD, it already has a framework on what exactly, how the ship owner should be reporting the data. And the OBD platform format itself will just take care of all the regulations in general. It will just take care of DCS, MRV, even because for the ETS part, we need the voyage level emissions as well. And that is for the emissions connect service of DNV. OBD is, I think, production, like the reporting standards like OBD is something that needs to be promoted on the higher level itself, because that will just take care of, the ship owner will just report a standard set of data, and that can be used according to the regulatory requirements moving forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
This concludes our question and answer section. Before we conclude, we would like to present a certificate of gratitude to Mr. Arvind Aji for honoring this event and delivering such a wonderful talk. I request Head of the Department, Dr. Satish Babu PK, and our esteemed faculty, Professor Shivprasad sir, to present the certificate to Mr. Arvind Aji.
Aravind is an example. If you do your internship very well, you will get a job. Okay. He did internship in DNV and you got a job there.
Yeah, actually,
It was a project.
no, like I did not do an internship at DNV, but I did additional internships at Lloyd's as well as in Bernard Schulte. So, and the support from the department is something that's, I have to comment on it because Sadisa was the HOD at that point of time as well. He was totally in support of me attending an internship out of the normal window as well. That just changed the course of my career, I would say, because there was, come on, I'm just totally grateful for that because it was an internship offer that was not what to say, usually being given for we have a normal window of 2 months or 1 month. That's a normal thing. We don't have additional internships out of that. But our batch received an opportunity to maybe just do an additional internship out of the window as well. And the support from the department was immense. I had the right to maybe cut a few classes to attend the internships and just make up for it.
Not
So-
for you. Okay. Not for you to cut classes. So what I want to urge you is now a lot of opportunities available. Don't limit to this to internship. You go to shipyard. A lot of online things are available. A lot of online courses are available. Okay. Don't just rush to Siberia the moment class is over. Yes. Okay. I've seen after my class, there triple 4 people and all on bike going to spend more time in department, university, library. Okay. Okay, Arvind, thank you very much.
Yes,
I
yes,
think
thank
in 2-3 years time, you have become a professional civil architect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now I welcome Navanidas, our SNA secretary, to deliver the vote of thanks.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Respected XOD Dr. Satish Babu sir, our esteemed faculty Dr. Keshav Prasad, our esteemed speaker, faculties, and all of my dear friends. As we conclude the enlightening inaugural webinar for our new academic year, also our golden jubilee year, we thank from our hearts to our esteemed speaker and our proud alumni, Mr. Aravind Aji. Mr. Aravind has graciously taken the time to share his profound knowledge and expertise with us. His insights have not only enlightened us, but also inspired us to embark on this academic journey. The topics discussed today are generally from outside our formal syllabus. But as we step into the industry, these are the crucial things that we need to know. So the tagging will be a formal word, but we should learn from Mr. Aravind how committed he is to the department and how we should give back to the department that has shaped us. To our audience, thank you for your participation and engagement. Let us carry the insights and motivations gained today to our daily endeavors. Once again, thank you, Mr. Aravindaji, for your inspiring address. We look forward to many more such enriching sessions from you. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening ahead. Stop here, meeting. Also, there is one more thing left. It is not related to the webinar. Meeting was leave.